All right, so here we are again. So I'll tell you what we're going to do here. We don't have that much time. We're watching the Tulip Mania video, but we ran out of time. I'll tell you what. Why don't we do this? What I'd like you to do is watch the rest of it at home, just for your own benefit. It's not absolutely necessary for Chapter 8 because it is about speculative bubbles, which is an interesting topic, but it's not really what Chapter 8 is all about. So what I will do is send you another link to the Tulip Mania video so that you can watch it at your leisure. Yeah, I mean, sure, it ties in with what we're doing here, but I just thought it'd be fun to take a look at it. But I'm not sure if we can spend another 10 minutes watching it today. So rather than doing that, oh, thank you. Lenny D. Okay, no, I'm not sure if I got it. What was that all about? Okay. Well, anyway, so let me just go get the link. And then that way you can watch the rest when you get a moment. And so let me just get Moodle open, because we do have other videos we want to watch as well. So that's why I think maybe we'll have you watch the rest of it at home. I mean, you saw how interesting it was. I mean, who would think that people would pay the equivalent of a house to buy a tulip? But when people get carried away with the speculative bubble, when they're convinced that the price can never go down, and this is exactly what happened. It's like with the real estate crash in 2008. People were buying houses like crazy that they couldn't afford because they figured, well, the worst thing that can happen is I can flip it to somebody else for a profit if I can't pay for it. And so that was the attitude. And then before I knew it, how the market collapsed and a lot of people were left holding the bag. And it took a long time for the economy to recover from that. And so speculative bubbles are a very potentially serious problem. And so there's been a handful of spectacular ones throughout history. So the Tulip Mania is one of the earliest examples of that. But there have been others as well. And of course, like I said, the real estate market in the late 2000s was the most recent example of a speculative bubble. So people can get carried away. They do. When they think that money's in the air, they just say, well, you know what the heck, let's jump in and try to make money too while it's available, not realizing what's going on. And so that's how it often ends up working out. So, all right, anyway, let's get back to macro. So today we weren't completely done with 8. We want to carry on. There was really just that one last subject to get to, and that was our discussion about the labor market. And then we can start 9, which is our first look at economic growth. Okay, so let's see. So here is where we left off. Let me just save this real fast. And we'll carry on from there. So, oh, by the way, if you're wondering, yes, there's going to eventually come a point where we have to start thinking about a second midterm, but let's just not worry about that for now. But it'll be here in a few weeks, because the first test was 1 through 3, if I remember correctly. So we've covered a lot of chapters in the meantime. So sometime next week, we'll start thinking about what we have to do to get ready for the second midterm. But let's not worry about that today. It's a nice day. It's Friday. Let's not have such negative thoughts today. We'll just carry on with what we're doing now. All right, so we got to look at the law of diminishing returns, which, as I said, really is one of the most important concepts in all of economics, because this works for all cases where we're using a variable input, such as labor, with fixed inputs, such as capital and land. So in the short run, when you can't change those other variables, this is exactly what typically happens. You have output goes up very quickly at first, then it starts to level off. Eventually it hits a peak and it starts to turn down. And this is almost without fail how this pattern works. If we're able to make changes, though, if we can shift this up by increasing technology or buying more capital or whatever, then the entire curve can shift up. But as long as we're still in the short run, we'll always have this basic shape for the total product curve. All right, now labor. Labor is a commodity just like anything else. There's a supply of it and there's a demand for it. Okay, so labor, the demand for labor comes from employers who have or are running a business, presumably of some kind, and they're producing a product which they would like to sell to the public. And so they would like to hire workers to the extent that the workers can produce enough goods and services to justify their salaries. All right, so in this example with the soda factory, I think we already mentioned this. How many workers do you ultimately hire? Well, first things first, you're never going to go past this point that I've drawn here, because the marginal product or the extra output from the next worker after will be 0 and then it'll go down. So the question is, where along this first portion of the curve, from 0 to 4, should we hire our workers? Well, it depends on how much we have to pay them and how much we can sell the soda for. As long as we can make more money selling the soda than hiring workers, then we'll continue to hire workers. All right. So in other words, if I can pay a worker $100 and he produces $150 worth of soda for me, I'm going to hire that worker. If, on the other hand, that worker can only produce $80 worth of soda, then of course I would not hire him. So the demand for labor is going to be derived from this total product curve. In other words, we know that we have this problem with diminishing returns. We also know that we have to sell our product in the marketplace. So we have to figure out what would be the optimal amount of labor to have in our organization to produce the highest possible profit. The more expensive labor is, though, the less labor we're going to hire, of course. So in other words, let's say wages start to rise, it may very well be the case that the amount of employees that I have right now is no longer profitable, and I may have to let some of them go. So normally wages don't go down, as we've seen in some of our discussions. Wages are said to be sticky in the sense that you don't normally see wages dropping in response to market forces. Typically, instead, what happens is if wages start to get very high, rather than people's wages falling, instead, typically what happens is people start losing their jobs. It's just the way it seems to work. It didn't always used to be like that. I mean, wages used to be more flexible in the 19th century, but now it's gotten to the point where it would be almost unthinkable that somebody's wages would be adjusted downward. What might happen instead is that sometimes in an organization, the full-time employees might be knocked down to part-time status as a compromise between firing them and keeping them. But normally wages are not flexible downward. They go up, but they typically don't go down. And when that happens, unless productivity rises at the same time, then that's going to lead to higher unemployment. So what that means then is that we can visualize that there's going to be a demand schedule. And what this represents is the amount of wages. Now, by the way, in this model, they're talking in terms of real wages, meaning inflation-adjusted wages, not nominal wages. Because ultimately, that's what really matters to the employer. How much purchasing power am I paying to these people compared to how much revenue they're generating for me? So this chart tells me that if people are willing to work for free, 12 million people will be hired. If the real wage jumps up to 5, we'll reduce that to 10 million people that we will hire. And you can see as the wage keeps rising, the quantity demanded of labor will fall. In other words, the number of people that we will hire will continue to drop. And so we've seen this before with the supply and demand curves for pizza. Remember when we saw that pizza was very cheap, people were willing to buy quite a bit of it. And as the price starts to rise, we'll buy less and less pizza. The same thing is happening here with, right? So the more expensive it becomes, the less profitable it is for an employer to hire them, and therefore the fewer people will be hired. Now, of course, in the long run, this is the short run, by the way, we're looking at a frame of time in which we really don't have any control over anything except the quantity of labor that they're employing. But in the long run, if wages continue to rise, you'll start to see adjustments being made in the labor market. Particularly, employers will search for ways to permanently reduce the amount of labor that they need. And the classic case is McDonald's, which, as you know, if you've ever been to one within the last few years, especially just before the COVID got started, a lot of McDonald's were starting to get these computer screens in the store where you could actually punch in your order and then take a number back to your table and they would just bring you the food. The reason for doing that is because even though those machines are clearly very expensive, it means that they need less people standing behind the counter taking orders. And so when you see something like that, it means that McDonald's is concerned that the cost of labor is getting really out of hand and it is really eating into their profits. So now it's worth their while in the long run to acquire more technology and reduce the quantity of labor that they need. Yes, Fernando.
Yeah, I'm still not fully understanding. Like, I'm reading the chart while you're going along, but like,
Uh-huh.
I noticed that it increases the wage. Wouldn't that be? Is that a bad thing? If the
Oh
like,
no, but the point of it is that as wages become higher, all other things being equal, we will hire fewer people. Okay. It's less profitable. In other words, it's not as cost efficient for me to have workers. And so what I'm going to start to do is find ways to minimize the size of my labor force. Like I was saying with McDonald's, if their wage jumps from 10 to 15, what I'm going to probably do is hire fewer people and then start buying those computer screens, because in the long run, that will save me a lot of money. The idea here is that, of course, real wages it's great when they're higher, but only if it's caused by higher productivity. Okay, so in other words, if productivity is rising, that means the workers can produce more output each hour and I can sell more products and make more money. So then I'm perfectly happy to hire more workers. But in the short run, if it's just the change in the wage itself and nothing else is changing, then I'm not going to want to hire as many workers when the wages rise. Okay. In the long run, if productivity is rising, then I can maybe hire more people even with higher wages. But in the short run, when nothing else can adjust, including productivity, higher wages means I'm going to have to reduce the amount of labor that I use, because otherwise I'll go out of business. All right. So yes, in the short run, higher wages will cause more unemployment. In the long run, if they were caused by higher productivity, then everybody benefits. All right.
so
And
the
that's what,
wages is for like the company, like it's for their benefit, since like you said, like they're making more if they're hiring less people, less employees. I mean, would that mean like the real wage rate would be like for the company benefit for them, like profiting, or am I getting that
no,
twisted?
no. I mean, what's the idea is here is that, think about this. Um, Anything that a company uses to produce their products, if the price goes up, they will use less of that input. Okay, so like if, for example, this is McDonald's and they're getting their beef from a certain supplier and he starts jacking up his prices, they're probably going to go find another supplier because they can't afford to keep paying more and more money for their beef. So everything they buy to produce their product, they have to keep a close eye on the expense, because the reality is the profit margins are very low, especially in a business like this. Like if you buy, like going to McDonald's and buy a Big Mac for $4, whatever it is, it might have cost them $3.50 to make it. So the extra 50 cents is their profit, which is not a whole lot. And the reason why they can survive is because they can sell a lot of Big Macs. But if all of a sudden the cost of making the Big Mac go up, they have to find ways to reduce that cost. Otherwise, they may have to shut their doors. So in business, one of the most important things that they have to worry about always is the cost of producing their product. And so labor is the biggest expense that they have typically. For most companies, labor is their number one expense. So if labor becomes more expensive, they really don't have a lot of choice. They cannot afford to continue paying higher wages, at least in the short run, unless because they have to be able to make a profit in order to continue in business. So in the long run, yes, when productivity is rising, real wages are not a problem for companies. But in the short run, higher wages are a real problem because they can't raise their own prices very quickly. And so they have to keep an eye on every dollar that they spend to produce the product that they're selling. And wages are no exception. So they'll do what they have to do to scrape by with less workers whenever this happens. So just like with any other good in the marketplace, the demand curve is downward sloping. Okay, so in the vertical axis, instead of having a price, we have a wage, but you can make the case that the price of labor is the wage. Okay, so this really is a price. It's just that it happens to be a salary or a wage. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity demanded of labor. And just like any other demand curve you've ever seen, it is downward sloping. So if next week the government suddenly comes along and says, all right, everyone, jacked up the minimum wage to $20 an hour, that's going to lead to a lot of unemployment. Some lucky people who get to keep their jobs will get the $20 and the rest will have nothing. So that's one of the biggest ways in which the government interferes in the labor markets. And it does cause a lot of chaos. The thing is, politicians pass these laws. They don't have a clue about economics. They say to themselves, oh, that sounds cool that we're raising wages and all, but guess what they're actually doing? They're also causing a lot of people to have no wages at all. Okay, so that in recent years has been a constant problem, especially in big cities like New York and Seattle, where they've jacked up the minimum wage from like $8 to $15 an hour. Well, the only possible outcome of that is that a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. It's just that simple, because these companies can't continue to pay such high wages unless productivity goes up. And in the short run, that can't really happen. So it's a very ugly situation. And that's in fact one of the reasons why McDonald's went ahead and bought all those screens, because they could see this coming. And so they may have done it anyway, but it might have taken longer before that happened. So especially in the city, all the McDonald's have the screens now, and that's why, because of the minimum wage. And that's just the reality. So, but anyway, since there's a demand curve, there's also a supply curve. This is coming from us as people. We decide how much of our time to spend working, how much time we're willing to, or how many hours of our labor we're willing to offer to employers. Now, clearly, the higher wages are, the more hours you'll probably want to work. So imagine, for example, you're in school now and you have the opportunity to work part-time at Staples. If they're offering, let's say, $6 an hour, you might say, it's hardly worth my while to go over there and give up all those hours for $6 an hour. But if they call you up one day and say, listen, we raised our wage to $20 an hour, you might say, oh my God, well, you know what, for $20 an hour, I'm willing to give up my weekends. And you'll go over there and start working like crazy, because that's a lot of money. So the higher the real wages, the more people are willing to work. And so because of that, the supply curve, as you can probably guess, let me jump ahead and show it to you, is upward sloping, just like any other supply curve you've ever seen. So in other words, as real wages rise, more and more people will come forward and make themselves available for work because it's worth their while. And in fact, what's interesting here is that this, again, brings up the very important concept of opportunity cost. When you have to stop and think about the decision whether to work or not to work, you have to compare the wage with what else you could have been doing with that same time. And suppose that by working during the weekend, all you're giving up is a bunch of like TV watching and that kind of thing. Well, in that case, the opportunity cost of working is not very high, and it's well worth your while to go out and work, especially if the wage is rising. But if you're giving up studying time, that's a very different matter. Studying time is clearly very valuable, and you might not be willing to give up on your studying time unless the wage is really, really high. Okay, because, you obviously have to do well in school. That's your top priority. So, the decision as to how much to work and not to work comes down to how much are you being offered and the opportunity costs that are incurred by working. But the bottom line is the higher the salary is, the more likely you are to work, because at some point the wage suddenly exceeds your opportunity cost and it becomes worth your while to start working. So we've got a labor supply curve, we have a labor demand curve. So you can probably guess where this is heading. We're going to bring them together now and find the equilibrium wage rate. And that will be, of course, the point where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. And in this example, that's $15 an hour. And there it is. Now, of course, the wage doesn't necessarily have to be in equilibrium at any given time. So in a free market, let's say if the wage out there is only $10 an hour, then that means the quantity demanded of labor is well above the quantity supplied, and we end up with a shortage. And so the wage will start to rise, in this case, up to the equilibrium level of 15. In fact, we're probably seeing some of that now, because a lot of people, after the COVID is starting to end, are not going back to work as fast as we might have thought. It may very well be that wages are at an artificially low level right now compared to the market conditions, and that wages will start to creep up again because there's a lot of employers are saying they can't find people, and that would be a sign that maybe the wage rate needs to go up a little bit more. But if instead, let's say wages were usually high. Now, as we know, labor markets are considered to be sticky, but in a perfectly free market where wages were not sticky, then this situation would result in wages dropping, because it means there's a surplus. And in the labor markets, a surplus is the same thing as unemployment. It's just another name for unemployment. So that's how it would work in principle. In a perfectly flexible free market, wages would simply drop until we found the right level. But the reality is that they're not that flexible, and so they're not likely to fall very much. And so instead, what tends to happen is unemployment persists for long periods of time until either the supply or the demand changes. Now, over time, these curves can shift, of course, just like any of the other cases we looked at. Let me show you a quick example. And this is how and why wages can rise over time. Say, here's the wage, here's the quantity of labor, here's the supply curve, here's the demand curve. The supply curve is basically a function of the population size, who's available for work. That doesn't change very quickly, but over time, if productivity rises, employers will want to hire more workers. Why is that? Because they can produce more output with the same amount of capital equipment. So if productivity goes up for any reason, let's say productivity rises, there will be an increase in the demand for labor and the real wage will go up. Okay. It's worth our while to hire more workers if we can get more output from them. All right. So like in that soda factory, remember we had that table here, and we're seeing how many people were willing to hire at these different levels of, let's see, hold on. It's here somewhere. Oh, I wrote all over it. No wonder we can't see it anymore. All right, let's do this. Suppose that over time, remember, this is in the short run, but suppose that over time, TP goes up. In other words, remember we did see this curve when productivity rises. In fact, let me move this down here so this can be my illustration of it. When that TP curve shifts up, what will happen is more output is being produced. In fact, why don't I produce or show you two new columns here. Oh, wow, making a mess now. What? Yeah. Here we go. I think I might actually know. Here it is. All right. What I'm going to try to do. Oh my God. Um, I'm going to try to show you a new set of data. And which results when productivity rises, as we saw in this graph, the total product can go up with the same level of output. And so suppose that, for example, as a result of that increase in productivity, I'll just call it TP prime, productivity increases. So you know what this is all about. And let's just say that now all of a sudden, as a result of that increase in productivity, I get the following output. Actually, I probably don't need this column. This thing is kind of a pain in the butt. Yes, Fernando, go ahead.
So then TP prime would be like the outcome, like the result of the TP.
It's the result. It means that total product has gone up as a result of higher productivity. So in other words, the total output of gallons of soda is going to be higher as a result. So let's just say that it goes to 8, 12. I'm just making these numbers up. Okay, so what you notice, except for 0, all of the outputs are higher than they used to be. So in other words, previously the first worker produced 3 units, now they're producing 8. The second brought the total up to 12 instead of 8, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say previously I was using 3 workers. Now I might want 4 workers or 5 workers because the output is that much higher for each unit of work or workers that I'm using. So just because of the mere fact that the total productivity is higher means that it makes sense for me to hire more workers. So that's what this is really all about. Because, or at the very least, even if I don't hire more workers, most likely the wages will go up. Because if I don't pay the people more money, they'll go somewhere else because suddenly their productivity is higher. And so they're worth more money in the open market. So I either have to hire more workers or pay them more money or some combination of both because I'm getting much more output from them than I did previously. Now, the productivity could come from a lot of factors. It could be that the workers get more experience and they're getting more comfortable with the job and everything. It could be because I gave them a training course of some kind. It could be because I bought better equipment for them to work with. It could be for a lot of reasons, but the bottom line is as output goes up with the same number of workers, more people will be hired and their wages will likely be higher as well. So this is how our standards of living go up ultimately, higher productivity. Yes, Fernando.
Okay. Quick question. So you could tell by as an employer to like make the decision to whether hire more employees. You could look at the this chart, the TP prime, to see like
Yes.
the production, right?
Right, because what I would probably do now this is a very abstract example. Most likely, what I would put next to this is the dollar amount of soda that this translates into. In other words, if I'm selling these sodas for $10 a gallon, then I can tell how much money I'm earning from these workers, and then I can compare it to how much I'm paying them. And so I can see that, oh, look at this. I'm getting more profits from these workers. Therefore, it makes sense for me to hire more of them so I can generate more revenues. So it's worth my while to hire more people or pay them more or some combination of both because they're generating more profits for me. TP,
Thank you.
TP normally stands for total product. All right, anyway, but yes, you can see why, because having 8 units instead of 3 means I'm collecting, let's say, $80 worth of revenue versus $30. So the more output I'm getting from these workers, for whatever reason, the more it is worth my while to hire them and to pay them more money, because that goes into my pocket. Okay, so anyway, but yes, productivity, this is the key right there. Productivity goes up, wages go up, more people work. So that's why it's so important. Productivity. Productivity comes from a lot of sources: more education, more training, more efficient uses of resources, more technologically advanced resources. These are all things that increase productivity, which, by the way, is the subject of chapter 9, since we're talking about this. And then once that happens, economic growth increases, economy grows faster, salaries go up, people have more products to buy, so in other words, this is what we want. This is why standards of living go up, ultimately because of higher productivity. And this is why wages were so low in the past. I mean, if you watch movie, let's say a movie about, if you remember the movie A Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens, with Ebenezer Scrooge and Bob Cratchit, why were they so miserably poor back then? Because productivity was so low. I mean, it took a long time to produce goods and services, and so efficiency was very low, and so productivity was low, and that's why their standards of living were so low compared to now. So, but anyway, so productivity is what's driving our standards of living. So anything that can increase that is going to be beneficial to everyone. I mean, nobody loses from productivity. Let's put it that way. It's like an amount for yourself too. I mean, when you become more talented at whatever it is you're doing for a living, it's only going to help you because you can produce more and you can get paid more. And it's just that simple. All right. Well, anyway, so I think that's it for labor. Yes, go ahead, Fernando.
So let's say productivity decreases, and while it decreases, that's when like the employer would need to let some employees go,
Yes.
and
Yes.
also that circles back to what we were talking about earlier.
Now, productivity doesn't normally go down, but let's just say that for some reason, the cost of producing soda goes up dramatically. There's one of the ingredients that we're using has suddenly gotten terribly expensive. Then productivity would go down, and we would end up probably losing some employment. And that does happen sometimes, like especially with oil prices. When oil prices go up, the cost of producing almost everything goes up because it's what generates our energy. And so rising oil prices is pretty rough on the economy. It lowers output, lowers productivity, it raises cost of production. And so many recessions have been triggered by rising oil prices because it affects the cost of producing goods and services. So yes, now one good thing though, technology doesn't normally go backwards. In other words, technology advances. The only time technology really ever went backwards was during the Middle Ages. After the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of knowledge was actually lost. And, people lived in just abject poverty for over 1,000 years before the Renaissance started. And like, here's a classic example. The Romans invented cement, and they used it in a lot of their cities, which is one reason why those buildings are still standing. And, but the knowledge was lost somehow during the Dark Ages, and it had to be reinvented in the Middle Ages. And so you can see productivity. I mean, you look at the Roman Empire compared to, let's say, the year 1000, people are living in much lower, their living conditions were actually worse than they were in the Roman Empire, because a lot of technology was lost, knowledge was lost, and technology was literally going backwards. And then all of a sudden the Renaissance came along and this started turning around. And then eventually we reached the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s. And that's when productivity really started to rise through the roof. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, typically people's standards of living were basically the same from one generation to the next. Whatever your father did for a living, you would probably do the same thing, and you would have the same income and the same everything. It wasn't until really the Industrial Revolution that it became normal for standards of living to rise over time, and that each generation would have a higher standard of living than the one before it. Before that, that was a very unusual event. It was pretty much everything just stayed the same because nothing was invented, technology wasn't being developed. The Industrial Revolution was really the start of that. And then since then, it's only gone up and accelerated ever since. And of course, in the 19th century, we see things like the railroads being built and steel factories being built and, telecommunications. And so that was another surge of productivity throughout the latter half of the 19th century, especially in the United States. And that's when standards of living really started to grow very quickly. And so anyway, but yes, productivity really is the big secret to standards of living. Now, the next chapter is actually a discussion about growth, and that itself ties itself back here to this discussion about productivity. There's a lot of theories about how growth takes place over time, of course, and we do have some videos that will explain this in very great detail. And even though it's a very abstract topic, I think you'll find it pretty interesting. So let's see, let's go back here and see if I missed any videos. Yeah, so like I said, I think what you should do is go back and re-watch the Tulipmania video because it's really quite interesting. But right now we want to focus on growth theory. And I have some very, very exciting videos to show you in that area. But first, let's go visit chapter 9 and find out what exactly this is all about. Okay. First, let me save this. All right, well, what is economic growth? Well, it's specifically, when you say the words economic growth, you're referring to the percentage change in real GDP over time. Now, if you notice, it's real, not nominal GDP, because as you know, real GDP refers to the actual output of goods and services. So from the perspective of our standards of living, that's what really matters, is real GDP growing over time, not nominal, but real. And so if it's growing, then our standards of living are going up. Now, having said that, though, if real GDP doesn't grow by, let's say, at least 2% a year, that's not really enough to prevent unemployment from going up. But if it goes up by more than 3 or 4% a year, that often is accompanied by an increase in inflation. So ideally, real GDP should grow within a range of 2 to 4% per year over time, which produces a surprisingly rapid growth in our standards of living. In fact, with a 3% growth rate per year, our standards of living would double about every 25 years or one generation. And so that's what we more or less experienced in recent years, except not, I mean, yes, there are ups and downs, but on average, that's pretty much what we've experienced. So it's understood, of course, that we don't have the same growth rate every year. It goes through ups and downs, which we know is the business cycle. Sometimes it grows faster, sometimes it grows slower, sometimes it even, sometimes growth is actually negative, but on average, in the long run, if you were to draw a picture of how the economy changes over time, let me see if I can put together a quick sketch here. Real GDP versus time. You'd see that, yes, it goes up and down like a seesaw. All right, well, this is not the greatest drawing in the world, but this is what we're looking for right here. Actually, let me improve that a little here. Hold on. It's kind of like an EKG here. All right, that's better. All right, this is referred to as a trend line. It's meant to capture the average value of GDP over time. Okay, in other words, these ups and downs are the business cycle. But this trend line is meant to capture the average value of real GDP through that period. So the slope of the trend line indicates how quickly standards of living are rising. Actually, this line isn't even the best, but oh, what is going on here? Hold on 1 second. Hello? Yes. Oh, hello. Yes. Yes. Yes, everything is this thing that happened just before the COVID. I had one summer when it wasn't even class. And, I never had an opportunity to try that. Right. Okay. Okay. Well, that's right. I'll figure it out. I'll let you know what happens. Right. Okay. All right. Thank you. Bye. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. That's one of the dangers of working at home. You might get interrupted by phone calls, but that's right. Anyway, so you know what I'm going to do? Just because it's annoying me, let me see if I can fix this trend line a little. It's supposed to go right through all those peaks and valleys. Oh no, stop that. Here we go. Oh, that's too much. All right, I think that's a little bit better. So in other words, the idea here is that in spite of all the ups and downs, let's say that on average, the real GDP is growing at a rate of 3% per year. Some years obviously much faster, some years much slower. The ones below, this would be a recession, for example. This would be an expansion, but there's some average growth rate that we're achieving. And what can happen now, if productivity rises, um, then that should go up. In other words, let's say that this is the trend line for, um, let's say, 2% per year GDP. And then all of a sudden, it goes up to 3 because of higher productivity. You might say, well, 2 to 3%, what's the big deal? But it can make a big difference over an extended period of time. If you start looking at a period of 10 or 20 years, this can really start to matter a great deal. Okay, and so the higher curve is caused by higher productivity. And this would be lower productivity. So to the extent that inventions are coming out and corporations are inventing new products that are what we really want, and they're finding ways to make them cheaper. And like entrepreneurs are creating completely new things that we never knew we wanted, and that all feeds on itself. And so productivity continues to grow. And in fact, the existence of people like Jeff Bezos. Oh, the only thing that can negative impact of productivity, I don't think there really are any. I'll tell you what, the only thing that could really be disruptive with productivity is if higher productivity causes an entire industry to go out of business. Like, for example, when CDs came out in the 80s, and they stopped making records for the longest time. If you worked in the record industry, you might have lost your job. Um, and so that would be one way in which productivity can be disruptive. But and that's it's unfortunate, but you would like to think that people can obtain training and move into newer positions. But this has always happened. When more advanced technologies come along, they can actually displace existing technologies. And so in short periods of time, you can have disruptions where certain industries may suddenly lose a lot of work, or they may disappear. And so that, in the short run, is one of the potential negative consequences. But in balance, standards of living rise more quickly because of this. And in fact, there's a very famous economist named, and you can look this up on the net if you're interested. Joseph Schumpeter. He coined this phrase, creative destruction. So, for example, when cars put the horse and carriage industry out of business, you might say, well, yes, there's unemployment in the horse and carriage industry, but overall productivity rises, as do standards of living, even though some people invariably lose their jobs. So yeah, if there's this is really the only potential negative consequence of rising productivity, and innovation and technology, and et cetera. It does have the potential to create unemployment in certain outdated industries. But I think you would agree that in the long run, if we don't have this creative destruction, I mean, we'd still be riding in horses and carriages. I mean, can you imagine if we said to ourselves in the early 20th century, well, we don't want cars because that puts people out of business in the horse and carriage industry. Well, I don't think that would have been a smart move. So it's unfortunate, but this is part of the process. You would like to think, and there does exist government aid for these cases. They do have programs where people whose jobs have been displaced by, let's say, international trade, can find money for retraining purposes. And that's enormously helpful because it's really not their fault that their jobs disappeared. So you'd like to think that society can help these people out and help them get new jobs in newer industries. But that's for the government to take care of. The private sector is constantly creating new positions. And typically what ends up happening is the high tech, well-paying jobs will eventually displace the low-paying jobs, and standards of living will rise. But the people themselves who are in these positions have to find ways to get themselves into the newer industries. And that's why, like people who, let's say, drop out of high school, or don't bother to get any education, are putting themselves in a really risky position because this trend is only going to accelerate in the future. And so it's really important. This is why it's so important to get as much education as possible so that this doesn't happen to you. You want to be in a position where you could move in a different direction at a moment's notice if you find yourself in a dying industry. All right. So it's like, have you ever watched that show, The Office? Dunder Mifflin is the paper company. There's always talk in that show about how the company is in a dying industry and how they're being swallowed up by the competitors, and they refuse to keep up with the times, and they don't want to have a website and all this and that. Well, this is exactly what Schumpeter was talking about. The big boys like Staples are bringing their websites and their, big savings, and they're pushing out of business the little guys like, Dunder Mifflin. And that's how this works. And so in the short run, it's very hurtful for some people, but in the long run, we end up with higher growth, higher standards of living. All right. So anyway, remember that name, Joseph Schumpeter, creative destruction. This is what capitalism is, creative destruction. Okay. Anyway, so now real GDP growth means simply the percentage change from one year to the next. All right. So, let me make a note here. This formula looks very scary, but this is equal to, this is the percentage change from one year to the next. Whoops, percentage change from one year to the next. And that's all it is. So this is the growth rate. And like I said, you ideally want to see this somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3% per year. Although for short periods of time, if it's more than that, that's fine. But if it keeps on like that, eventually prices will start to rise. We saw different periods in our history where we had these long, enormous periods of rapid growth. And we didn't always end up with a lot of inflation. Like in the 80s, the economy was absolutely booming. And we didn't see a lot of inflation. And in the 90s, late 90s, with the internet bubble, that reminds me, we were talking about bubbles and tulip mania. In the late 1990s, the stock market went through something similar because of all these newfangled internet stocks that were coming along. People were buying them like crazy and pushing their prices through the roof. And then the whole thing collapsed because the stocks weren't worth that much at the time. And so the stock market collapsed in around 2001, and it had to start rebounding slowly. A lot of people would have referred to that incident as another speculative bubble, where people were just getting carried away. What was happening is these new companies had just gotten started, and people were buying them as if they were like long established companies that already had a profitable track record. And no, it was a little too soon for that. Like even Amazon, it took about 10 years before Amazon started to make money. It isn't that fast. I mean, making a lot of money takes a long time. So even a crazy successful company like Amazon, it takes a while before it can really start to earn money. And so, so the prices were getting to ridiculous levels, and then all of a sudden they just collapsed, and a lot of people lost their shirt. Now, of course, in the meantime, some of those same internet companies did eventually become very successful, but their prices were being pushed up to absurd levels. In fact, I remember at one point, Amazon's price within a year went from like $10 to $400, way before they started even making money. And so, of course, that couldn't last. But yes, Amazon's only been around since the early 90s. Jeff Bezos started that company. He was selling books out of his garage, actually. And he came up with the idea that, you know what, people are starting to get this newfangled thing called the internet. Maybe they'd be willing to buy my books through the internet. And before you knew it, he was one of the most successful people in the country. It was a great idea. The timing was perfect. And he did everything just right. And before you knew it, everybody in the planet is doing all their business on the internet. So that's why Jeff is so crazy rich. Just like in the 19th century, why Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller was so rich. They were in the right place at the right time. They had the right vision, and they caught on to something that was going to be super important, path-breakingly important, and that's how they became so rich. All right, but anyways, that's a story for another day. By the way, there's a really excellent historical series that you can find if you're interested in this. Let's see, it's on the History Channel. It's called "The Men Who Built America," and it's all about the so-called robber barons like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and Carnegie and Ford and Morgan, and it's just about how they came to be so successful. And I believe if you look around, you can find these on the internet. I don't think you have to buy them, but I'm not sure about that. But there they are, and you might find this very interesting. But now they've got a new series on called, I think it's called The Engineers Who Built America, or something along those lines, because they've been advertising it like crazy. They have an episode about the Statue of Liberty right now. But it's a very well done series. Anything the History Channel does, you know it's good. So anyway, enough of that. So like here, if real GDP goes from 10 to $10.8 trillion from 2016 to 2017, the growth rate over that period is 8%. Okay. And you know what, let's do this. Let's go look at Fred for a second and see what our growth rate has been in recent history. All right, let's try this chart. Now, you're going to see it's not a very exciting chart. This is real GDP. See, now my chart was more fun, wasn't it? But the reality is, if you're looking at such a long period of time, it's going to look pretty smooth. You know, let's do this. Let's look at the last 5 years. Yeah, even then, it's not changing that much, is it? Except this, of course, was the COVID down here. Now let's go back to 10 years. So you can see, now you can't see the actual, you have to figure out for yourself the growth rates. What they're showing here is real GDP itself. But you can see it's gone from the late 50s, this is the 40s. This is basically World War II, post-World War II, $2 trillion up to about 20 in a period of about 80 years. Now, let me just get out my calculator and see what that works out to. That works out to almost exactly 3% per year. So that, well, that's pretty interesting. Although, of course, you can see in some years it was going up more quickly. And during these gray bar periods, which are recessions, it actually became negative. Growth actually was negative. The economy slumped, and then it bounced right back again. But the trend line, if you could draw a trend line through here, you'd see the growth going back to World War II was about 3% per year. And that means that the size of the economy is doubling roughly every 25 years. Okay, which is exactly what we could hope, everything we could hope for. Now with technology accelerating the way it is, you might expect to see this going up even faster in the near future. It raises a lot of interesting questions about just how fast can the economy grow without triggering a lot of inflation. I would expect that that speed will accelerate in future years because, you know, all the technology makes productivity higher, and that means that we could probably grow even faster without worrying about inflation. So yeah, the next so many years are going to be very exciting to look forward to and see how fast the economy can grow, and imagine what kind of amazing products will be available to us in the future. It is pretty mind-boggling, isn't it? Yes, it is. All right. Now, here's an important concept. Per capita is Latin, of course. It means per person or per head. It actually means per head, literally per head. But what does that mean? Well, often we try to measure standards of living not on the total size of the economy, but on how much that translates to on a per person or per capita basis. So for example, in the numbers I gave you here, if the population in 2016 was 300 million and it went up to 305 million in 2017, what's actually happened here is that in 2016, this $10 trillion translated into about 33,333 per person. And the next year that went up, because both GDP went up in the population, that went up to about 35,409.84. So we can see that as an individual, you're not, I mean, it's not just the entire economy is bigger, but the amount per person or per individual is actually larger as well. And so we can calculate the percentage changes. Now, you notice that the real GDP growth was 8%. The per capita growth is only 6.23%. Okay, because what we've done is we've taken 2017 real per capita GDP, and then this one is, and these two are both 2016 real per capita GDP. And so that only went up 6.23%. And what that basically means then is that the population grew a little bit faster than the size of the economy. So while the total went up 8%, on a per capita basis, it went up about 6.23%. Now that's important because you want to make sure that everybody's sharing in this expansion of the size of the economy, and this shows that they are. Okay, so the average person is in fact gaining because the economy is growing so fast. So most economists feel that this is really the best way to measure standards of living. It also makes it easier to compare the performance of different countries to each other. All right. So like, you know what, let's do this. Let's go look at the internet for a second. See if we can find a list of countries by real GDP. Now, if you go by that, the US is obviously going to finish on top. All right, where are we? Here we go. Look at this list. US 20.49 trillion, followed by China at 13.4. They're about a third behind. Then Japan is like at a quarter of the United States, Germany about a fifth, the UK, United Kingdom, et cetera, et cetera. So on that measure, the US is by far number one. Well, what if we change that to real? Oh, wait, this is nominal, sorry, but real would be very similar. What about per capita, though? That's what we want to know right now. Let's look for real per capita GDP. And I think this list will surprise you a little bit. Okay, now remember, this is per capita. Now, here's Qatar, which is a Middle Eastern country. It's their main export is, of course, oil. So what's happening here is that they have a lot of oil wealth and a very, very small population. So their real per capita is about $128,000. Then we have Macau, which is a tiny little strip on the eastern coast of India, which used to belong to Portugal. And it is sometimes called the Las Vegas of Asia or something. It's a very cosmopolitan town. And then we have Luxembourg. Look at that, Luxembourg. What's going on? Why are they doing so well? Again, because they're very affluent, but they have a tiny population. In fact, a lot of their business comes from banking. A lot of European countries do their banking in Luxembourg. And so you've got a lot of people earning a small country, but they're earning a lot of money from banking. And so their per capita is quite a bit higher than the United States, which is way down here somewhere at number 13. So look who's ahead of us in per capita. Then we have Singapore, a tiny little country. It's a little strip of it's like a little piece at the southern tip of Malaysia. Most of their money comes from electronics and other types of export businesses. Brunei is a oil-rich country. Look at Ireland. Look how high up Ireland is. Again, it's because their population is so small. And we have all these oil countries. We have Switzerland, San Marino, Norway, which is also has a lot of oil money. And then finally, we get to the United States. The US is still ahead of most of Western Europe, Germany, Sweden, Australia, Belgium, Canada. So we're still doing well even in that respect, but 13th in the world versus number one. But sometimes these numbers can be a little deceptive as well. Okay, so yes, they have very high levels in these countries, but a lot of it is because they have one major source of revenue and a very, very, very small population. So like Kuwait, oil, that's all they do. Switzerland, of course, does a lot of other things, but they have a small population. Norway, lots of oil money now, but very small population. Hong Kong is in the same boat as Singapore, a very small country, a lot of high-tech businesses, a lot of banking, and so they have a very high per capita GDP. Iceland, I'm not sure why Iceland is so far up the list. I'm sure their population is minuscule. So, but anyway, if you want to read through the list and you can see, and in fact, you'll be surprised by how low these numbers can actually go in some of these countries, some of these very, very poor regions in Asia and Africa. These numbers can get down into the like under $1,000 a year. It makes you wonder how these people survive. And in some of these countries, it's so low they can't even estimate it. But anyway, so a lot of economists feel like this is truly the way to judge how successful a country is, or at least as far as their incomes go. And so they pay close attention to how much this is growing per year. How do you like that? Okay. Anyway, potential real GDP is, of course, what the GDP would be if we were not wasting any resources. In other words, no cyclical unemployment. If we haven't quite reached that level, that means we're wasting our resources. It's like as an individual. Do you ever reach a point where every minute of your day is used as productively as possible? I don't think so. I think it's natural to waste time. I mean, or at least I shouldn't say waste time, but sometimes you don't feel like rushing. You just want to relax. That's, so you're never, let's just say that your lifetime earnings will probably be very nice, but it's always going to be the case that you probably could have earned even a little more had you chosen to just work all the time and never have any fun. But here, what they're really specifically referring to is just when nothing is being wasted in the sense that there's no cyclical unemployment, the level that we could reach is called potential real GDP, or sometimes natural. Now, this curve we're about to look at, if you notice that magic word aggregate, when you see that word in economics, it means total. It refers to the entire country, not a single company like our bottle factory, but the entire country, which means on the vertical axis, instead of having bottles of soda, we have real GDP for the entire economy. And on the horizontal axis, instead of having the number of workers in our factory, we have the total labor that's employed in the United States. So this curve is our total product curve. You might recognize it from before. The shape is a little different, but it goes up at a progressively slowing rate. And when we're at, quote, full employment, meaning no cyclical unemployment, then we are at potential real GDP. So what that implies is that to get past that point, we have to go beyond full employment, which sounds strange, but it would mean that, let's say, for example, people would be working overtime. People already have jobs would be working overtime and that kind of thing. Below full employment, where there's some cyclical unemployment, we're going to find ourselves at a lower level of real GDP. And wherever that is, that means there's something being wasted and there's going to be cyclical unemployment. Now, don't worry, we're going to use this curve for other things too. I mean, that's not the end of it. So in the labor market, now we already discussed the labor market. We just want to bring this back again. We have the supply and demand for labor. And normally in the labor market, we think in terms of real wages rather than nominal wages, because that's what people really respond to in the long run. In other words, if somebody offers you, let's say that you are, you're looking for a job and, or you're already working, you would not want to work more hours if you are simply being compensated for the rate of inflation with higher wages. So normally we assume that people respond to real wages rather than nominal wages. And of course, the demand is the same thing. This is what employers are thinking about when they hire people. So we have the demand. We're going to change the notation a little bit here. With the real wage here, the quantity of labor here, and now we'll call this LD for the demand for labor to distinguish it from the demand curve for a product like apples or cakes or whatever. And it's downward sloping, as you can imagine, because the more costly labor is, the less will be hired, because higher wages reduce the company's profits. All right. Now the supply, same thing. This is, remember, coming from individuals. You will probably work more hours if you're offered higher real wages, because the opportunity cost of whatever else you could have been doing is now likely to be lower than the wage that you're being offered. All right. There comes a point when you say to yourself, I've had enough, the wages are more important now than my free time. At least for a while, I can afford to work more hours and make money, and for at least a short time, give up my other activities. And of course, when you bring them together, you get the equilibrium, and and LS means labor supply. And LD is labor demand. And of course, this is the equilibrium. That's where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. In other words, no unemployment. Actually, what I should say is no cyclical unemployment. And that's where everybody's happy. Now, we're going to ask ourselves some important questions here. What is it that's driving increases in potential real GDP? Why does it grow over time? All right, so let's answer these questions. Number one, labor, this actual supply of labor can increase potential real GDP. Number two, of course, productivity. So even if we don't have more labor, if it becomes more productive, more output will be produced, and therefore potential real GDP will have to grow as well. All right, and that means our standards of living will go up, which is exactly what we want to see. Now, supply of labor. There's several reasons why this can go up. Workers can just simply work more. The employment population ratio, which we discussed way back. What chapter was that? Was it 6? Yeah, I think this is it. Employment, let's search for this. Just a quick reminder. Oh no. All right, let me just quickly, I thought it was in here. Oh, because, okay, because there's a dash in there. Oh, for God's sake. I just want to, that should have been in there anyway. Just a quick reminder, it's the employed over working age population. And then finally, an increase in the actual working age population as well. Okay, there's more people, more things can be produced. So what's going to happen is a higher supply of labor, though, more will be employed, but this can actually drive down the real wage. Now, by the way, I do want to mention one important point here. Just to clear this up, wages are often said to be sticky, which means that they do not drop in response to a worsening economy. Okay, when we see this, what they really mean is this refers to nominal wages. Real wages can rise or fall depending on the rate of inflation. I wanted to clear that up right now. Wages are sticky in the sense that if you make $10 an hour, that's your nominal wage. And if the economy slows down, your employer is not going to say to you, listen, we want you to work for $9 an hour. What they'll probably do is say either we want you to work less hours, but we'll still pay you $10 an hour, or we want you to go home because you're not working here anymore. But real wages can go up and they can go down. If they don't rise fast enough to offset the rate of inflation, you could actually find yourselves with higher nominal wages and yet lower real wages. So remember, in these labor market models, we're thinking in terms of real wages, which means that they can go up and they can go down, even if nominal wages don't change. So here we're assuming labor supply is shifting to the right, and you can see the real wage did in fact go down. Although, like I said, it may be the case that the nominal wage has stayed the same. In real terms, employers are paying less, and because of that, they're happy to hire more people. So let's think of this as wage one, quantity one, wage two, quantity two. And this is due to a change in the supply of labor. More people are willing to work. Okay. So now when this happens though, let's go back to our aggregate production function, which remember refers to the entire economy. Oh, here. So the quantity of labor goes up, and guess what that means? Output is going up too. Let's say from Y1 to Y2. Real GDP is often measured, indicated by Y. Quantity of labor, call it Q1, Q2. So the fact that more people are working means there must be more output. So we move up that curve and we find ourselves with more output. Now, having said that though, look at this case. What if productivity of labor goes up? Not just the supply, but the productivity. Because productivity is higher, we can produce more output with the same goods and services. So the same resources. Potential real GDP has to be higher. So remember the total product curve for the bottle factory? And soda bottle, I should say, soda bottle factory went from here to here. Well, guess what? The same thing's happening here with the aggregate production function. It shifts up. So at the same level of employment, we've got more output. Look at that. Well, this is a good outcome. We like this one a lot. More goodies are available to us, without increasing our resources. It's just that simple. Wow, that's a nice one. Okay, now, there's an additional factor here though, which makes things even better. Higher productivity also increases the demand for labor. So there's going to be a second impact of this. due to higher productivity. More people are going to work. And so guess what? After we move from A to B, we'll then move from B to C. So there's A to B comes about from the productivity itself. B to C comes about from the increase in the demand for labor. So we end up going from A to B to C. And more people have jobs. Wow, that's nice. Okay, and then down here, that part came from the increase in productivity. So we jumped up, the curve jumps up due to the productivity increase, which means we could have more output with the same number of workers, but more workers were hired, so we have more again. We move up the higher production function from B to C. So look how much output went up because of productivity. It really went up a lot. Before we had the example with higher, more labor, we just moved up the same production function. But now we were getting two different beneficial impacts. And so we end up at a much higher level of real GDP. Man, that's a lot of increase. All right. All right, now what we would like to do, although not right now, we'd like to analyze, take a step back and analyze how and why productivity is changing. Okay, it doesn't just happen because we want it to happen. There's a lot of things that must happen, take place in order for productivity to grow. Remember, like I said, for hundreds of years at least, standards of living never changed until we got to the Industrial Revolution. And then all of a sudden they started going up very quickly. So we want to ask ourselves why. What was there about the Industrial Revolution that caused standards of living to rise so rapidly? So we want to analyze the factors that ultimately determine productivity, especially in the labor markets. So, and by the way, I did mention we have several good videos about this. So I think we'll cut it off right here. We want to next time finish up this discussion about these graphs, but we also want to start looking at some of our videos, which dive into the whole field of economic growth, which is an important subfield within economics, which only tries to explain and analyze how growth takes place in the economy. What factors are there out there that can cause productivity to rise so quickly? And, it's more than just the labor market. Other things have to happen as well. For example, we need people to invest more and to save more. And, there's other things going on too, but a lot of it ultimately comes down to labor productivity. So hopefully this inspires you to always do your best because you know that you're contributing to growing productivity and higher standards of living. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. The more efficient you are, the more standards of living can grow. So, all right, I guess we better stop here. And I'll see you all again next Tuesday.
Thank you, Professor.
All right, see you next time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you so much, Professor. A lot of great stuff that I learned today. Thank you.
Good. All right. Interesting.
Have a great weekend. I'll see you next class.
All right, bye.
Bye.